Forward TV. The world is thinking.
So my name's Tony Gilland. I'm the Science and Society Director at the Institute of Ideas. We've had two very interesting and at times passionate debates already, one about climate change and the science and politics of climate change, and one about neuroscience and in relation to social policy and politics and responsibility in the legal system. This debate is much broader and more open-ended. It's titled, "What are the barriers to science in the 21st century?" And really, the reason why we decided to put this debate on was for two things. Last year, we had a breakfast banter, and we asked the question, what should we want from science? And it threw up all sorts of interesting issues. And one of the speakers, introducers, said, we should want nothing that is immediate or instrumental, which generated quite a good debate, but the time was very limited. So we thought with this session we would ask, generally, what do people think are the barriers to science? But within that mix, I sort of fully expected the question about instrumentality to come up. And indeed, only 2 weeks ago, the Research Council's put out a report about the research impacts of science that they fund, which is great. You know, they're celebrating the impacts of the work that they fund. But it also made the point that they would be looking at changing the review system for funding of scientific proposals to include a direct assessment of possible economic benefit. And they also said that people should not be worried that this would narrow the range of research that would be funded, but it was more about making explicit something that already takes place. To that, also, I put out a survey just over 2 weeks ago, not a particularly scientific survey, it was entirely self-selecting, and I pushed it out as far and wide as I could and got as many people to respond as I could to find out what scientists thought of this question, just to sort of inform the discussion. One thing that struck me very much was that in this survey, and the figures stayed very much the same from a fairly early point, they seemed to settle down around fairly consistent figures. 85% or so of the scientists thought that the disinterested pursuit of knowledge without any constraint or external pressure was a desirable thing for society to engage in. But only 50%, or just over 50%, thought it was realistic. And I thought that was quite interesting as to, well, what then are the barriers to pursuing this desirable aim, and why, and indeed, that the minority of people who didn't think it was desirable, what might be the reasons why it wouldn't be desirable? So that might be a question that we can address in the discussion as well. I have a very eloquent panel. I hope they're eloquent. I think they're eloquent. That they're certainly well qualified to speak. So I'm going to introduce them to you. They now make their opening comments, and we'll have a bit of a discussion and plenty of time for your questions. Extremely high profile over the last, well, at least 5 years, if not more, and particularly his very prominent role within the House of Commons Science and Technology Committee. It's done a lot of very interesting reports and put government, I think, under a lot of very good pressure on particular issues. And most recently, you might have seen last week in the papers, they've been consulting about abortion and whether you should require 2 doctors to sign off an abortion, and also the debate about the time limit that's come up on how long abortion should be. So they do great work, and so we're delighted to have Evan here. Second to speak will be Ruth McKernan on my immediate left. Ruth is Vice President of External Research in Europe at Pfizer, the pharmaceutical company. She graduated from the University of London in biochemistry and pharmacology and has a PhD in the mechanism of action of antidepressant drugs. She's worked at the University of California in San Diego. She's worked previously for Merck, another major pharmaceutical company. And she has recently published her first book for non-scientists, Billy's Halo, which was shortlisted for the 2007 Mind Awards. So that's Ruth. And then she'll be followed by Professor Monica Grady on my far left. Hello, Monica. Monica is Professor of Planetary and Space Sciences at the Open University in Milton Keynes. She's previously been the head of meteorites and cosmic mineralogy division in the Department for Mineralogy at the Natural History Museum. And she's particularly interested in meteorites, as you might not be surprised to hear after all that, and has written a number of books in relation to that. She also gave the Royal Institution Christmas lectures, Voyage in Space and Time, in 2003. And she was formerly a member of the Particle Physics and Astronomy Council Science Committee, and is now on the committee of the Science, Technology and Facilities Research Council, which is the sponsor of our science debates here at the Battle for Ideas. So she'll have some insight into what the research councils are up to. Finally, we have Dr. Bill Durodie on my far right, who's a senior lecturer in risk and corporate security at Cranfield University. He was previously the director of the International Centre for Security Analysis and the senior research fellow in international policy at the 5-star research assessment rated war studies group of King's College. A very good research group, that one. Anyway, Bill's issues of interest to him that he's written about widely and spoken about widely relate to risk and risk consciousness, and also the erosion of expertise, the demoralisation of elites, the limitations of risk management, and the growing demand to engage the public in dialogue and decision making in relation to science. And I'm sure Bill will say things to provoke us all in our debate and discussion. Okay, so without further ado, Evan, would you kick us off, please?
Sure. Would you like us to sit or stand?
As you prefer.
What's the fashion?
The fashion these days is to sit.
I will stand. Thank you very much, Tony. I'm sorry I was late. I have parked on double yellow lines and I haven't asked anything else of the sponsors except one glass of wine last night and half a prawn sandwich. So maybe a parking ticket coming your way, and I don't care if I'm value for money or not. It's a fascist state we live in if you can't park on a Sunday. Anyway, I'm a bit... The reason I'm late is that I had the email that everyone, I think, well, certainly perhaps all politicians fear getting today, which was because I've been doing some work in support of research on hybrid embryos and in favour of the right to have help with assisted dying and in favour of a woman's right to choose on abortion. I'm a freelance journalist that's been asked by the Daily Mail to write about your personal life. please, I got a phone call first, I booted it to email, and please now's the time to confess. And I was desperately trying to find something interesting to say about my personal life, because I fear I'm going to die of shame when they find that I've been singularly boring. But it has been a little stressful today, so I'm sorry if I appear a little flustered. I hate going first, and so my revenge to the organisers is to do little preparation and to have a little rant. So please, it's Bill's style, but I do apologise to my fellow panellists on this. So what I found, firstly, I just want to deal with this question of where the government stands on this, because we have a government that gives a very mixed picture on its support of science. Certainly in terms of funding, there has been significant increases in recent years, okay, and talk of doubling. But doubling a small number is easier to do than doubling a large number, and without being too party political about the Conservatives, the funding of science in 1997 was not a lot. So to increase that significantly, it was a low base, but I think credit has to be given. But in terms of higher education, we haven't seen, for that part of the funding, we haven't seen a similar rise, and that has created issues. The second thing is, one can say, what about the support for science? And once you get beyond the personality of David Sainsbury, and as I try and do and look at the issues, again, it's a mixed picture. The government boasts about how although it failed on GM technology, and it was a regrettable failure, and there was a lot of hostility to that based on anti-science and pseudoscience, and my own party, which is being whipped into shape much more quickly now, is guilty on that as much as the others. But having failed on that, they then claim to have got a good record, and I'm not sure that's the case. They can just say, yes, on nanotechnology, they beat off the hordes of opponents with their powerful ideas and their very clear manifesto. That's Prince Charles and his grey goo, which I don't think was high-hanging fruit, shall we say, and then they say that they're very big on stem cells because we finally dragoon them into passing the therapeutic cloning regulations in 2000, 2001, although, again, that, I have to tell you, it was a struggle to get them to move on that. But if actually you look at even stem cells, the nonsense position that they put out on hybrid embryos, that is the idea that, yes, they're in favour, it's okay to use human embryos destructively for research up to 14 days, but you wouldn't be allowed to do that for ethical reasons for things that were subhuman. I don't know if that's me. I don't think so. It's not me. Not guilty. I will switch it off nevertheless. Somehow it was not possible to do this on things that were less than human. That is, where you took a human nucleus and put it into an animal embryo cell, an enucleated animal ovum. And we took a huge amount of time, 2 select committee reports, a campaign that I was involved with to show that the government only had the support of Josephine Quintavalli and a Catholic archbishop. And if the government only has them for support on a policy like that, then I thought they could see they were heading for disaster. And we finally got them to change their policy, but it was a struggle. But on other issues, the government says, well, it's not worth having the fight. So when it comes to doing something about the creeping teaching of creationism in schools, got to be careful, not just in science lessons, but teaching in religious education creationism as fact, okay? Because I don't think it should be taught as some people believe this, not this is the case, which they haven't even got near. They've been extremely weak, and when it comes to recognising that homeopathy and indeed other unproven things that have medical claims, and I don't just include complementary and alternative therapies in that, but they're the best examples because they boast about the fact that they are part of the normal research-driven proof of efficacy agenda. They have allowed homeopathy provings, which are, well, I don't have time to explain what they are, but they're the opposite of proof, to count as evidence of efficacy for the purpose of getting MHRA approval, and that's because homeopathy is popular. But to subvert the whole of healthcare product regulation in that way is unacceptable. It's a disgrace, and it shows, I believe, I would argue, that the government is not as good as it claims to be on these issues. They won't debate that with me. They seek to choose their own ground, and I understand that. Now, one of the questions we've been asked to address is to what extent should government direct research programs and what scientists do. And I think it's fair to say, and I'll explain this a bit further, that I think the government does have a valid interest, not just an interest, a valid interest in directing public funding that it raises from taxes, from unfair taxes in the main, but I mustn't stray into that, for its priorities, okay? Or Parliament's priorities, or society's priorities. I have long argued, and I continue to argue, that it's not their role to judge between what are the best grant applications to fund. They have to do this very much at arm's length on a Haldane-type principle and set priorities for the research councils, who then must be independent. It also follows that I think it's outrageous that government departments, when spending money directly on commissioned research, put strings attached in respect of the free publication of the scientists doing that research. There's still far too much of that about. They said they dealt with it when I raised it about 6 years ago, and it's clear that they haven't, because whenever you talk to someone who's doing research for the government, they don't have academic or research freedom that we would understand. Understandably, one can say, yes, we'll agree a publication date, but the government to suppress publication of research that doesn't support their policy is a disgrace. And I refer you to the Science and Technology Select Committee's report on evidence-based policy making that we published last year. One example of this is the urgency that the government wants to give to translational research in, for example, biomedical research. And I've argued, and the Select Committee's argued, that if they want to do that, they should not do it at the expense of basic research, or if they do that, they have to be transparent and say, we are cutting basic research in order, in a short-sighted way, in my view, to try and push translation. So there's an issue around to what extent they're entitled to push knowledge transfer. I think they are entitled to identify they want more applied research, and they have now agreed to do that with extra funding and not from the basic research. But what I don't like is research councils deciding that they're going to give funding for worse research, worse applications, simply because there's an obvious knowledge transfer application, and reject better research applications because there's no obvious, even for basic research, even if they're both basic research, because I think that is second guessing and awards prizes to people who can fantasize about potential knowledge transfer rather than have a rigorous necessary approach. Finally, if I may just have a word about the role of public consultation, because this is again where I've come to blows with the government. And the interesting thing is around, again, the question of biomedical research, for example, in the regulated area of fertility treatment and embryo research. Because what the government did, and again, this is in our Science and Technology report, how not to do consultations, what consultations are not. We identified that consultations, are, in other words, the sort of thing that Tony just talked about doing, are the worst way of gauging the opinion of the target group, because clearly there's bias in the way you put the question, there's bias in the people that answer. It's not quite as biased as a focus group, but it's not a very good way of measuring it. Just genuine opinion polls with large sample sizes, with sensible questions, and indeed deliberative opinion polling work is a far better way. What the government did is ask a stupid question in a public consultation about, for example, hybrid embryo research, get a write-in answer from the campaign groups, and then, which is fair enough, that's what they do, it's what they're set up to do, it's what I would do if I was doing that sort of thing, but then saying, well, we're not going to proceed with this because the public don't support it, when in fact, when they were finally persuaded to do proper public opinion work, the public did support it. I would go farther, and I'd say it is interesting to note that the public aren't keen on this yucky thing, like human-animal hybrid embryos up to 14 days, just like they probably weren't keen on taking an organ from a dead body and putting it into the body of a live person. It's never been allowed if we'd asked the public their view of organ transplantation. But regardless of whether the government, the public like it, if it's legitimate research and Parliament hasn't banned it, it must go ahead, because we cannot have research priorities set simply by the yuck factor, or even public opinion directly, even when it's not based on the yuck factor, even when it's based on serious political or religious objections. That's not an acceptable way of doing research, and it's a continuing struggle, because the legislation is very clear that the public does not have a veto on research in this way, but it's a continual struggle to get the HFEA to remember that its job is to carry out what Parliament asked it to do and not try and win popularity stakes with the Daily Mail. We cannot allow the Daily Mail to persecute me in this way. No, to have a veto on medical research. I feel, now I've come back round to the Daily Mail, I feel my work is complete. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks very much, Evan. Now for something different. We've got Ruth, please.
Can I stand up?
If you like to, yeah.
Okay, I'll stand up as well.
Just
as
move the
started
microphone
that tradition. And I'm actually going to talk about something quite different, I feel. I'm expecting we're going to hear a lot about education and a lot about money for research and what the government spends it on and what the government doesn't spend it on. But actually, I'm going to try and persuade you that I think that the barriers to science in the 21st century are more likely to be cultural than either financial or educational. And for me, coming from the pharmaceutical industry, I can see how much this all costs. And cutting-edge science is now very expensive and very interdisciplinary. And I think to be really successful, we've got to the point where we have to link science from many different disciplines and really communicate well from one field to another. And my background is in neuroscience, and when I pick up Nature or Science or any scientific magazine, I don't have to stray very far from my field to not understand what's written in those articles. And I certainly struggle with your work. And it's not easy, because we've become very, very specialised. And I think for us to do a really good job in the future, We need to pull together ideas from different areas, and working in silos or even thinking in silos. I think that's going to be the biggest barrier to research in the 21st century. So you might think that the pharmaceutical industry is a very mature industry and it's very applied, and it's really based on the pursuit of knowledge, things we know about, with very tangible aims. It costs $800 million for each new drug that's launched, and we depend on people from lots of different disciplines to bring every drug to market. It takes, on average, 16 years to make a drug. So we have chemists who design the molecules. We have computational scientists who try and marry up new compounds with their target enzyme or receptor and propose improvements. We have biologists who try and understand the human genome and see, by interacting with which parts of genes and their pathways, how can we make better drugs, how can we make better medicines for patients. It requires people from lots of different disciplines, and it requires disciplines that overlap. And what we find hard is actually recruiting people that have knowledge of several different disciplines. It's very, very hard to find mathematical biologists who can model what a drug does to the body, how long it's going to stay around. I'm sure some of you will remember the Genero incident. Actually, mathematical modelling could have predicted the type of toxicities that were seen in that tragic case. So I think in any one area, we can't truly predict what scientific advances will be necessary to be successful in the future. We couldn't do it in the past, and I don't think we're going to be able to do it now. Who would have thought a few years ago that understanding the way that distant stars are identified would turn out to be relevant for diagnosis for Alzheimer's disease? In the area of Alzheimer's research, fragments of a small peptide called A-beta linked together to make oligomers and then plaques, and that builds up in the brain. To try and diagnose people with Alzheimer's disease and to try and understand what drugs do to that process, we need to measure in the blood all of those fragments that are made and all of the fragments that are circulating in the blood. But there are thousands and thousands of proteins in the blood, and when we separate them into a two-dimensional array, there are thousands of molecules there. So to see what changes a drug might make or what proteins are present in people with Alzheimer's disease and not in others is exceptionally difficult. But the sort of technology that's used for identifying distant stars is exactly the same technology that we use for identifying proteins that change in the plasma from people from Alzheimer's disease. We never would have set out looking at distant stars to find a treatment for Alzheimer's disease, unless, of course, it was for inspiration. So we need to engage in a culture of what I would call co-opetition. The reason I say that is we live in a global society. I work for a global company. All the big pharmaceutical companies, the medical research companies, they're all global. We can invest our dollars in any part of the world we choose. China and India are cheap. The UK has a fantastic reputation for innovative science, and Sainsbury highlighted this in his report. But I think if we don't get our act together, we will see research bleed from the UK in the way that other industries have. And so I think that's going to be really important. And when I say co-opetition, if you don't know what I mean, you might think about putting a man on the moon. So there was competition between Russia and America, but there was great cooperation between different disciplines in America, the physiologists that understand what space does to the body, material scientists, the astronomers, the computer scientists at the time. And that's what I mean by co-opetition. It's a mix of cooperation of people from different disciplines in competition with an outside force. And I recently took my kids to the Kennedy Space Centre, and actually I was quite shocked when I saw the lunar module. And if you haven't seen it, it looks like something that a sixth form project might have put together with excessive use of rubber solution glue and lots of aluminium foil. And that's not to decry sixth form projects, but at the time we thought it was the very limit of what science could do. Putting a man on the moon was the most amazing thing. I remember watching it when I was at school at the time. I thought it had all been done, and yet, we could never have thought of mobile phones or nanotechnology or stem cell research. And these things are so close on the horizon. And even in my own area of making drugs, we think of drugs as small molecules, but actually they're now antibodies or cells expressing genes or modified RNA that controls whole differentiation pathways in the body with one small entity. So of course, I think we need education to underpin the future of science. And as Lord Sainsbury said in his recent report, Race to the Top on innovation in the UK, a major campaign to improve science, technology, engineering and mathematics teaching in school is needed. And who could argue with that? And of course we need adequate funding. And I think both blue sky and applied, because we don't know, we can't predict the value of blue skies until way down the line. And in the same report, Sainsbury said, in today's global economy, investment in science and education is not an intellectual luxury for a developed country, but an economic and social necessity. But for me, money and education are hygiene factors. It's like sanitation and fresh water. We won't develop without them. But to be really successful, we need to recognise the globalisation of science and industry. We need to recognise that to make UK PLC leading in science, we need to bridge disciplines effectively and be open-minded to new ideas wherever they come from. Thank you.
Thank you, Ruth. Okay. If we'll now turn to Monica, please, for a planetary perspective.
Okay, thank you, Tony. Whoops. And I guess I better stand up as well. Okay, so my field is very different from Ruth's, and my perspective is very different from what Evan talked about, because he was taking, again, mainly things that have come up before the Select Committee in terms of stem cell research, genetic modification of food, etc. And Ruth has been talking about from a pharmaceutical perspective. I come very much from a physical sciences background. I'm a chemist and a geologist. I now work as a planetary scientist. And the research that I do and the people that I work with are very hands-on. We do experiments, we have equipment, and we need equipment and people to carry on doing that research. So what are the barriers that prevent us doing that? Well, I prefer not to think of them as barriers, but more as hoops that we have to go through, or hurdles that we have to go through, that are put in front of us by a benevolent government of whatever shade, having to justify all the time what we're doing. Now, justification for research is not a bad thing. I think it's an excellent thing. For many years, if you're not careful with a research project, you can keep going down a blind alley and not get anywhere and get yourself, dug deeper and deeper and deeper. If you have to come back to write a grant proposal, if you have to get your project peer reviewed, then you can be sure that you're being kept on the straight and narrow. Fine. As long as these things don't have to happen too often or take up too much time. And I think if you talk to any active research scientist and you say to them, what about writing a grant proposal? They'll just sigh and throw their arms up in the air in despair and say, oh, you just waste so much time doing it. You write the grant proposal, it goes to review, or you review somebody else's grant proposal, and then it has to go to a committee, and this, that, and the other. And sometimes you think, things would be so much better if they said, right, here's a pot of money, it's X, the number of researchers are Y, everybody can have X over Y, get on with it. And we'd be so much, you feel sometimes you'd be so much more productive because of this constant requirement for justification. But we do have to justify, because the money comes from the public purse. We have to be able to stand up to anybody and justify why we do that research. I think that is a duty for any active scientist, that they have to be able to justify to a member of public. And, for the purposes, a member of public might be your grandma, it might be your son, your niece, whatever. who doesn't know or understand your field, you have to be able to justify to them what you're doing and why it's important you're doing it. Because otherwise, the response is, well, why is that money being wasted on that particular piece of research when we've got so much more money, so much more requirement for hospitals or schools, when there is so much poverty in the world? Why are you wasting your time working on an instrument that's going to go to Mars, which is what I do? How can you justify wasting your time working on something that's going to go and look for life on Mars? Well, I've got an example from in a similar way to Ruth and the Alzheimer's, in that the research that I have worked on went into building an instrument for a project called Beagle 2, which you may remember as being a fantastically successful, right up until the very last second of its life, a fantastically successful space probe. I'm also working with colleagues on an instrument on a space probe called Rosetta. Beagle 2 went to Mars, Rosetta is going to a comet. It hasn't got there yet. Now, on both those instruments, on both those space probes, there was an instrument called a mass spectrometer. Now, in a lab, a mass spectrometer is, you know, this big, about the size of a table, this high. The mass spectrometers that were made for Rosetta and for Beagle 2 are this big. And what they're doing in both cases is they were going to look for carbon dioxide, and they were going to look for the characteristics of the gases on Mars's surface or on a comet. That instrument has been the subject of a translational award, and it's being used to develop a field portable instrument to take out into the field to Africa to test for tuberculosis. All right? So this thing that's on its way to a comet that crashed on the surface of Mars is being built now to go out into Africa to test people for TB. At the moment, it takes 8 weeks to test for TB, to take a sample, get it sent to a lab somewhere else, get the results back. That is far too long. This gives you a diagnosis within 2 hours. Much less, actually. So that's an example of something that came from Blue Skies research. And it's a great example. Research has to be subjected to constraints, because you can't do everything and anything you want to do, because there is a limited amount of money. But you cannot constrain research too narrowly, because that assumes you know the answer, and research isn't research if you know the answer already. So although we say, right, you've got to be aware of possibilities for knowledge exchange, you certainly have to take opportunities for public outreach, there has to be this opportunity for Blue Skies research as well. And so the barriers or the hoops or the hurdles are all towards making it more difficult to do those things that you want to do. Some of them are valid, justifiable, but it just makes it that tiny bit more difficult for us to do it in the way that we would want to do. Now, I'm responding a little bit to what Evan was saying about the government's record on funding for science. The government has been absolutely fantastic since 1997 in pouring money into science through a research infrastructure fund, which has been fantastic. It's renewed buildings, it's reviewed instruments, the infrastructure that had decayed through the previous Tory government. But what it hasn't done is produce more people to actually use those instruments and populate those laboratories. And that is one of the biggest hurdles that we have to overcome in the next few years. Ruth made a reference to it, which is the declining number of students who are doing maths, sciences, engineering and technology. Right from the youngest school students, right from the sort of 4 and 5-year-olds. They need excellent teachers who can continue to inspire and carry on the children through the period when they're, really interested in dinosaurs, to get these sullen teenagers over the hump at 14, 15, 16 when they suddenly decide, no, not bothered, can't be bothered. I've got one at home, all right? I know what it's like. Yeah, it's very difficult. So we've got to be able to make sure that we have people who can help teachers. It's a duty of scientists to go into schools to assist teachers, to bring to students the exciting, dynamic way that science can do things, that you can achieve things. You have to have something to inspire children. And I think one of the biggest barriers that we've got for science at the moment is the way that science is often taught in schools. It's so prescriptive by the time you've got to your 12, 13, 14, 15-year-olds. And really, I think that is where the problem starts to set in. And that is something that I think we need to look to in the future. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Monica. Everyone's covered lots of different things, which is great. Bill, please.
Right, well, obviously the fashion has now become to stand, so I'll stay seated. If I'd been asked to give this talk to you 5 years ago as to what the greatest barriers are to science in the 21st century, I would probably have suggested that the biggest barriers are, 1, the demand by activists that science should proceed on the basis of a so-called precautionary principle. In case you don't know what that is, essentially it says, act first, find the evidence later, which is an incredibly dodgy way of approaching science, I would suggest. The second thing I would probably have raised is the obsession of government that science should support the British economy, which has been raised in your survey. In other words, science becomes instrumentalist. And Evans just reminded me that the obsession with dialogue is also largely counterproductive in science. And on dialogue, I usually leave the last word to Henry Ford, who, when asked, said, well, if I'd have asked the public what it was that they wanted, they would have asked for a faster horse. Now, it may come as a surprise to you, but the categories I want to nominate as the biggest barriers to science in the 21st century are, firstly, scientists themselves, and secondly, science educators. And when I say science educators, I mean that in completely the opposite way, I suspect, than that which Monica has just raised. And I say this not because I'm an anti-science Philistine. I actually originally studied physics at Imperial College a long time ago and went on to start a PhD in astronomy at the University of Manchester, although I ended up with a PhD in politics instead. But more recently, as a social scientist, indeed, I found myself defending science, progress, and reason from those with very little appreciation of it. So what I say is said, with a good deal of reflection on the matter. And I think the first thing to say is that scientists and science educators are also members of the public. And as members of the public, they are not immune to some of the dominant cultural trends, which Ruth referred to, that we see in society today. And those include, I would suggest, a degree of social pessimism, an exaggerated perception of risk, a low view of human beings and human activity, and a pursuit of fairly limited objectives. Let me give you 3 examples of what I mean. In 2004, a Royal Society study group published a document called Making the UK Safer, Detecting and Decontaminating Chemical and Biological Agents. Now you can tell straight away this was feeding into the so-called war on terror. And the study essentially took at face value what it described in its introduction as, quote, growing concern amongst the public as to the possibility of a chemical, biological, radiological or nuclear attack. I don't doubt the qualifications of the scientists who were involved in that study, and I don't doubt that it was technically rigorous in terms of should there be an incident with anthrax, this is how we should go about dealing with it. but I would suggest that it was scientifically unsound. And I say that because I was taught that the first job of any scientist is to interrogate the axioms, to precisely not take the world at face value, and to interrogate the appearance of things. So you would start by asking, well, is there really growing concern amongst the public as to the possibility of chemical and biological attacks? And even if there is, what does that represent? Is it due to media hype about the possibility of chemical and biological attacks? Or is it due to an enhanced sense of insecurity amongst the public, which may have very little to do with the possibility of chemical and biological attacks? And you should start by explaining that, rather than diving in, assuming the problem at face value, and publishing a report which, ironically, ends up giving credence to the fact that the public are concerned about chemical and biological weapons, because obviously, if the scientists of the Royal Society are investigating this, then it's a major issue that people are worried about. So, ironically, they ended up driving the public concern that they were suggesting was a problem in the first place. Earlier this month, my attention was drawn, as I was looking through the BBC website, to an article entitled "Game Violence Study is Launched," which I have here at the front if anyone's interested. This was a study ostensibly to look into the consequences of violent computer games on young children. The opening 2 paragraphs are actually quite instructive. I'll read them out to you. The government is asking for evidence for a new study of the effect of violent games on children. Psychologist Tanya Byron will head the study, which will also examine how to protect children from online material. Tanya Byron, if you're not familiar, is famous from Little Angels and House of Tiny Tearaways. Now, my question to Tanya and the government is this. If you're just starting to study the effects of such games, how do you know that children need protection? So, clearly what you've done is you've assumed the conclusion at the outset. And there is an increasing tendency in so-called scientific projects nowadays to do that, to start with a conclusion and then look for confirming evidence. That's not science, even if it's conducted by people who call themselves scientists, and even if there's a willing research team happy to take the government's money in order to examine an outlook which chimes with their own. My last example appeared in a copy of, for my sins, I received Food Standards Agency news, however often it's published, I presume it's monthly. And they've got a front page article there entitled, "Agency Calls Industry to Account on Food Colours." And we're informed in that after a detailed study, industry reps were called to a meeting at the FSA to explain what they were doing to regulate the use of food dyes. It's only inside the brochure that you read the report's author, Professor Stevenson from Southampton University, noting, quote, "We know there are many other influences at work." So in other words, again, a predetermined agenda has not just influenced how the science was presented, but what science was conducted in the first place. Now, of course, there's nothing particularly new to any of that. But the fact that it appears to me to be an increasingly common phenomenon today suggests to me that scientists themselves are not entirely innocent. The problem, in part, comes from a very shallow empirical view of science that sees truth as being somehow arrived at by summing up and averaging all the possible available data. Hence, there's a supposed need to listen to every voice across the spectrum, including what are defined as hidden or unheard voices in scientific debates nowadays, usually those of children, animals, and the planet. Now, leaving aside the remarkable ability of some to speak on behalf of the immature, the dumb, and the inert, the real problem is that one of the real purposes of science is to exclude particularist opinions at every opportunity, not to include them. Of course, science has never been value-free, but it should strive to become so. Next, educators. Now, it is true that fewer and fewer young people are studying science after the age of 16. A-level physics has declined by 35% over a 15-year period. Undergraduate chemistry has gone down 30% over a 10-year period, and world-renowned physics and chemistry departments have been closing to the point where some are suggesting we'll be unable to sustain any industry, let alone explore much further. The response of leading science educators has been to demand that the curriculum be made more, quote, relevant and accessible, whatever that means. The suggestion in a number of reports Beyond 2000, Science Education from 14 to 19, and the Roberts Review, is that science education should be pitched at the vast majority who will, quote, consume science rather than produce it. And accordingly, the new GCSE focuses on debates and controversies within science rather than what is caricatured, and sadly I think Monica's fed into this, as dry facts. Now, no doubt there's a good many pupils who'd rather engage in an excited dialogue over some of the ethical issues raised by science and be given free expression as to the limitations of scientific evidence. But without any building blocks, it's unlikely that any of this will go very far other than to further confuse and concern them. Students have always complained, as you I think revealed, that science is too hard and irrelevant. But the only thing that's new today is that we take those views seriously. It's educators who've lost their confidence as to the importance and impact of science. Exploring science as some kind of textual media analysis has removed the one element essential to a proper understanding, which is practical experimentation. Hence, we've also seen a growing use of field trials, which are open-ended, empirical, and inconclusive, over the use of controlled laboratory experiments, which are conceptual, theoretical, and rigorous. Children are being shortchanged and confused by these developments, and there's little evidence that they lead to an enhanced uptake of science studies at a higher level. But again, the government did not wait for the evidence before introducing the changes and the new GCSE. Science was never taught as objective fact. That's a caricature. Rather, it presented itself as a succession of models approximating to the truth. But now, by representing all of science as a series of negotiable truths, students are simply absorbing the uncertainties of the elites and those who ought to be educating them. Finally, because I don't want to upset too many people, I'm not trying to suggest that all scientists or all science educators have fallen into this trap, but there's now sufficient to confuse matters and shape a problematic agenda. It will be the job of scientists and science educators to get their own house in order before complaining about government pressure, activist lobbying, or public indifference. Thank you.
Okay. Where to begin? I don't know where to begin. I'm going to get you in very quickly, but I mean, there's a lot on the table. I think I'll just start with asking whether anyone would like to respond to Bill's comments about science getting its own house in order. It seems only fair. Monica.
Well, I just want to not respond, but I think add to what Bill said as far as science education in schools is concerned. A lot of the excitement over the last few years has gone out from science education because of risk and health and safety. Now, obviously, one has to be healthy and safe. One has to make sure that you don't take too many risks. But school chemistry, school biology, school physics, when I was at school, which is a long time ago, was all about doing experiments, and they were great fun. You know, now you can't boil benzene to make aniline anymore. You know, what a terrible thing. But kids these days, all too often, if they're going to do an experiment, actually just watch a teacher do it, and that's really dull. They often don't do the experiments themselves, and it's the hands-on experimentation that is so exciting, especially when it goes wrong. And then you have to do it again. It's that aspect, you know, things are, you know, people are just too risk averse. We've gone too far the other way, and I think that's part of the problem of the students not going on to do science at school.
Okay, Ruth, would you like to comment on anything that Bill said, or anything else that anyone else said? But I mean, I just thought that this question about education that came up was you'd raised it, and it seems quite important. And Bill's, highlighted the fact that the government doesn't really seem to understand science at the level of it's introduced, or it's allowed to be introduced, a whole new science curriculum, which is about pitching it at the consumers of science rather than the producers of science. Doesn't that worry you?
I think there's two separate issues. One is science to train people to be scientists, and the other one is an understanding of science so that you can at least be aware of what's going on around you, and if necessary have an informed opinion on things that will matter to you. Do you want your children to be vaccinated against human papillomavirus. I mean, it's important to have some understanding. And I actually don't feel quite so bad about science education. For the amount that I see personally, I hand out prizes. We have a science week. We take kids from the local schools. They do a hands-on 1 week at Canterbury University, and they spend some time in the labs at Pfizer. And 16-year-olds are incredibly smart. They give presentations at the end that are equivalent of a university degree level presentation. They work really hard. There is nothing wrong with the brains of our kids. They're very, very good. I just think we do need to do something more to rekindle that sense of fun. And when I think back to my own chemistry A-level, the excitement of leaning over the Bunsen burner to see what's happened, to the thing that you've been heating and how it's changed form. I didn't even notice I'd set my hair on fire. So I think, true story. We need the excitement there.
You wear it short now.
Blonde before.
Evan.
Yeah, I disagree with Bill on some aspects of what he said, because firstly, there is a whole agenda about how we get more people interested in science, and I think the fundamental problem is that school pupils aren't doing science because they're not encouraged to do science, because the science teachers are not specialists. They're not keen on science, and the problem is that you have this issue of the brightest of science graduates being snapped up, not just by industry but by the city, because they're numerate, and therefore you're not getting, and we have data on this, science being taught by specialists and probably not therefore by enthusiasts. So therefore you don't get people going through to study science, and then you don't get people studying physics. They don't become physics graduates. They don't go back and teach fluid mechanics. It's not just a vicious circle. I always say it's a viscous circle. It's just to point out that I remember something. So that's I think that is one of the fundamental problems. The second is, of course, that we have a market snuck up on us in higher education that is crazy. It's 80% funded by the taxpayer. So the taxpayer should say, look, we want at least 14% of the courses to be physics and chemistry, so that prioritise filling those to meet the needs that we need as a country, because we're paying your bills, and then you can offer forensic science and fishing, or whatever it is that people want to do because they've seen it on the telly. Okay? But the government says no, and the university say, well, we're independent, leave us alone, and the government says, of course, it's a market, and it's a market driven only by what is demanded by students, and students see physics and chemistry as hard, and therefore they don't do it. Or if they don't have a physics and chemistry department in their region and they need to be home based because the only way to afford to go to university without stacking up too much debt, they don't have that option, and therefore they have to do music therapy and biochemistry or something. And that isn't what industry wants. I mean, I know people from Pfizer, and they say they want people with chemistry. They don't want people with that highfalutin stuff. And finally, on the issue of the curriculum, what I urge that we all have, and this is part of the compulsory national curriculum, is an understanding of the scientific method. I'm less bothered about whether people remember the periodic table in order as I still do, because I'm an anorak. I want people to understand the scientific method, and I think I'm not so much against this new curriculum, because it may teach people that to answer these questions you have to have a method of experimentation, testing, and that what the scientific method is, and we need to have a minimum requirement for this in the civil service, for example, which is one of the recommendations of our report. And I'm not convinced that this new course doesn't do that. Clearly, once you start teaching the complex stuff, you may need to do even more of the factual stuff at a later stage at A level, for example, or at university. But if that's the price we pay for people that understand scientific technique and the scientific approach, then it's a price worth paying. And if we have to, only way to do that is to have a subject called climate change and science rather than physics, chemistry, biology, then I'm prepared to take that risk if, and I accept what Bill says, if it wasn't properly evaluated and it doesn't achieve it, then I wouldn't be in favour of it, but it's certainly worth a try.
Okay, thanks, Evan. Sort of meet government desires and objectives. Have scientists become compliant? Right. Here at the front, do we have the microphones? Great. So take this guy here at the front, and then this gentleman here in black.
Thank you. My name's Justin Kilcullen Nichols. I am a science teacher. I qualified last year. What are the barriers to science in the 21st century? The brochure starts with, in recent years, the UK government has trumpeted the importance of science. Well, I've always been taught that actions speak louder than words, and the actions from the government seem to indicate that they want to take a great big step backwards in science. First of all, in Parliament, we have a distinct lack of scientific understanding, with MPs, like my local MP, Mike Hancock, signing off on homeopathy. In a letter he wrote back to me questioning his signing, he hinted that maybe homeopathy would provide a viable alternative to expensive anti-cancer drugs. I have hosted that online if anyone's interested. We also have going to education, which is my area. I consider myself a scientist who teaches as opposed to a teacher of science. We have Tony Blair giving his blessing to the Vardy group of schools, who teach with a Christian ethos, including the teaching of evolution, of creationism alongside evolution as a viable scientific theory. And we have and I'm sorry, Evan, I have to disagree with you on the new GCSEs. We have the, quite frankly, piss-poor GCSE syllabus, which was introduced last year, the upcoming 2008 Key Stage 3 changes, and the upcoming 2008 A-level changes. Granted, I understand what you're trying to say about teaching the scientific method. A good science teacher should have been teaching the scientific method in the first place. What we're going to be left with is a course which is lacking in practical work, lacking in developing the skills we need for scientists to go ahead and perform experiments, and we are going to be left with more barroom chat where we have teenagers discussing complex issues without having to go and research the facts and figures from primary sources and apply the scientific method.
Thank you very much. You can applaud if you wish. Yeah.
Can everyone hear in the back? Just to go back on with Bill, do the panel and anyone else in the audience believe that science today is too limited? Science in the 21st century is too limited in its view, because there's this notion in science that if it can't be proven, then it doesn't exist. And so, again, do the panel and anyone in the audience believe that science today is limited in its approach and it only deals with the physical form? But there's more to life than just the physical form. There's more to life than what we can see. And coming from a scientific background myself, I know and I can testify that most scientists see a tree rather than a forest, metaphorically speaking. They see the tree as the be-all and end-all, but behind that tree, there's a big old forest. And I know many scientists who themselves have no time for spirituality, or, for example, they deal only with the consequences of a research. So I'd just like to open that up to the panel again, and the audience. Do the panel and the audience believe that science today in the 21st century is too limited? And Professor Monica
Very quickly,
Grady, do you believe in UFOs, spacecrafts, and life on all other planets of the solar system?
Okay, thank you. Right.
Respond or not?
Yeah, we're going to take a few questions at a time, so if you just make a note. Right, can I get an idea who wants to speak over this side? Sorry? Right, this gentleman here, and then I'll take David Perks.
Sorry, one thing I'd say is that there seems to be lots of comment. Industry regularly says, why aren't people doing science degrees? And speaking as a fairly recent graduate, you start looking at jobs at the end of your degree, having slogged through a 4-year physics degree, which everybody agrees is very hard. And suddenly you look at all these jobs and they say, please apply if you're a graduate. And no, there's very few jobs, unless you're very specific, that actually require a scientific or technical background. So if you are opening it up as a market for degrees, why do you expect people to do degrees that are perceived as hard when you're rewarding all degrees equally? So.
Okay, thank you very much. Right, David Perks down here, and then can we get the old microphone up to the back, please? There's a lady there at the back.
Just want to take up a couple of things on the school education thing. I cannot bear the argument that says that young people aren't interested in science, and I think it's just a lazy excuse. They are. They're interested in all big questions about anything that you throw at them. And in terms of the way that we deliver it, we have to be realistic. It's not the fact that there aren't enough teachers, it's the fact that we don't value science education. When you've got a government that, as already been said, has basically dismantled academic education because it believes that young people can't cope with it, then it's no surprise to think that young people don't think it's very important. Just at the university level, if you look at that end, why don't they go into physics and chemistry? Well, we turned half the chemistry courses into forensic science, archaeology and forensic science and whatever. Even if you look at the government's category of STEM subjects, it includes all of them in it now and claims that they are real science degrees. But the simple fact is, there are so many forensic science undergraduates, none of them are going to get a job as a forensic scientist because we don't need them. So what are we doing? We're conning people that the degrees they take are worthwhile and interesting and relevant, when actually they're nothing. They're just a watered-down chemistry degree.
Okay, thank you very much. Right at the... Yeah, you got the microphone, yeah.
I was just really interested by this idea that there's kind of two types of science education, or there should be two types of science education. One for the kind of general masses who will never really think about it and just need to be intelligent enough to allow real scientists to get on with their work and not be too up in arms about stem cell research. And the other people who are actually going to go on into academic science. And I really don't think that that's a good idea. I think, firstly, you don't know at the beginning of someone's education whether or not they're going to develop an interest in science or become a good scientist. So to offer only a very cursory introduction to science to everyone would seem to be a mistake. And also, everyone is perfectly capable of having an academic approach to science. They may decide later on that actually they're much more interested in history or they're much more interested in philosophy and they'd much rather study that at university. But I don't think there's anyone who's completely incapable of thinking about science seriously and being interested in it and being interested by it. And there's an argument for making science lessons fun and for having lots of practical experiments and blowing things up and things, but just being fun in and of itself is not enough to inspire people. It has to be interesting. And the real problem with things like the new science GCSEs is that actually all it is rehashing what's been going on in the newspapers. And you don't ever really get the magic of science, which is having an idea that explains the things that happen around you and explains the world around you. You just get to argue about whether climate change is a problem or not. That's not actually that fun.
Okay. Okay, and then right behind you.
I just wanted to, addressing the point of science and spirituality, I think what many people see as a great weakness in science is actually its greatest strength. It knows, the scientific body knows what questions are within its domain, what it can and cannot do. I think that we should realise that it can only see a tree because the tree is a scientific tree and the other trees are not. And it's not up to the scientists to discuss.
Okay, all right. It's getting slightly surreal for me on the. But thank you.
The mystics meet in the ether after this.
Yeah. Okay. And then this gentleman here. Thanks.
Thank you. First of all, a word of comfort to my fellow physics graduate on my left here. There are jobs that demand physicists. I have recently retired. My last role was to try and recruit a team of 4 people to write scientific software. We absolutely had to have people with top physics or maths degrees plus software. Less than half of the people who applied had British passports. That's interesting. I ended up recruiting 3 non-British educated people and one who was British, although he was actually brought here as an infant member of a Tamil family fleeing Sri Lanka and with a very high work ethic. The jobs are there. There are people who value it, and good luck is all I can say on that front. But I was staggered at the less than 50% Brits even applying for that work. I now try to help in schools. I've signed up with STEMnet to go into schools, as Monica suggests, as it's the duty of scientists, those of us who believe in these things. And I've been signed up for 4 years now. One school has invited me in for 1 day. Now, I suggest that there's an issue with teachers not wanting people in. I don't know what's going on there, but I'm available, free, and I even stand the humiliation of having to prove that I'm not a paedophile to do it.
That's a very interesting point. And then we'll let the panel come back on it, but I'm going to take these two people here desperate to get in. Then I'll bring back the panel, then I'll come out again. So,
clear my throat. I'd like to follow on from that because I've been involved in organising Science Week lectures in the Hampstead area, and we've had to use the facilities of 2 private schools. The state schools do not have the facilities to help us. The teachers do not have the time to get involved much as they would like to, and they claim the work involved in maintaining the paperwork for the core curriculum has something to do with this. So it seems as though bureaucracy is playing a part here as well. But it is, this is one specific example, Hampstead, 2 private schools heavily involved in Science Week, and the state schools not able to get involved. And just to follow on from the idea of experimenting, of course, Fred Hoyle blew up his parents' kitchen.
Thanks very much. Yeah, and that lady there.
I totally agree with Monica about the necessity of the double-edged sword of justification, grant applications, research assessment, and so on. We had these lovely examples of things coming from unexpected places, the test for Alzheimer's, the tests for tuberculosis, that was it. But I very much doubt these are in the grant application. And in the absence of a blue sky box to tick on a grant application form, I wonder what we do about fitting blue sky research, including new interdisciplinary approaches, into justification. I just wonder if the panel have any ideas about how this should actually be approached, whereas in the past I think it just emerged naturally, and whether some kind of quota system should be introduced or other methods for dealing with that problem.
Okay, all right. What I would like to suggest actually to the panel is a lot of the questions around science education. That's a really great question. Perhaps if we can respond primarily to the science education issues and then continue with the discussion with the audience on the funding and the blue sky stuff, so it doesn't get too confused. Okay, right. Who wants to go first? Anyone?
I'm happy to. What did you say we're focusing on?
Science education. But you can respond to what you like. I'm just suggesting that if we deal with science education questions now, and then we'll move the discussion on to other issues. Sure. Otherwise, it will get confused. Evan.
Yeah. I'm not going to answer about spirituality, not because of that, but because the Battle of Ideas wouldn't let me have a rant against spiritualism and religion and all that. Someone else did it, so I've got to behave myself. So a lucky escape for both of us. Can I just deal with the Mike Hancock point? I mean, he's very hostile to animal experiments. So if homeopathy doesn't do animal experiments, he'll prescribe it for himself when he's critically ill, and I'll help him swallow it. So I'll say there's a friend of mine. But you have a point. You do have a point, which maybe we'll come back to, about the understanding of the importance of evidence and publication and peer review and all that sort of stuff, which was the subject of our report, which only scratched the surface of some of the issues. On the question of education, David Perks made the point about degrees, and I entirely agree with him. What the government does, David says, is very naughty sometimes. They'll take a year, 1998, and then 2005, and say there's been an increase in STEM subjects. But they never prospectively define what their particular data points are going to be. So and it's quite a jumpy up and down sort of thing. So unless you agree in advance, and we've been trying for the last 3 years to pin down the science minister to say, are you going to do 97 to the latest date? Are you going to look at the overall trend, and are you going to look at the physics, chemistry subjects? Because, as has been said, we do need forensic scientists, but the Forensic Science Service want chemists. They don't want people who've done forensic science and whatever. They want people who've done chemistry, and that is a problem. The woman at the back was talking about the question of whether that it's wrong to try and have a separate stream, as it were, for everyone else dumbing down and other people who are going to do it. And I don't think anyone's proposing that. The question is, what do you? It may well be that those people who come through this new syllabus who then want to do science have big catch-up to do. But I think it's absolutely essential that they're attracted in the first place. And my hope is that they will be attracted, because remember, science is competing against Shakespeare. And I'm not a cultured person, but I thought he was quite a good writer, and I liked it. And I loved maths and chess and stuff. So, and I found those benches in the chemistry and physics labs really uncomfortable. And I didn't do research after my degree because I didn't want to sit on those uncomfortable benches. I like having this. It's that trivial for me, but I have to tell you, I hated practicals.
Evan, let me just ask you on that though, because it's
probably orthopaedic.
Absolutely. However, there is a real point that she's the lady at the back made, and this gentleman over here, that you haven't addressed, which is actually it's bloody boring. This constant discussion of the newspaper headlines and the same old stories, put to you by a science teacher who's absolutely bloody useless anyway, and doesn't know very much about how to analyse these issues and get them excited about that. A lot of students are saying that they find this uninspiring.
Well, they haven't done it yet. I mean, I'm not.
Well, they are. They've been doing it.
Well, okay. I'd like to see the evaluation. I'm not in a position to argue with the teacher who says they don't like it, but a lot of people don't like things changing. Okay, there's a group species around. I can't remember what they're called. Conservatives, small c, and so I'm always a little suspicious of that, except when it applies to me, when I'm quite right to resist the change. But I have to say that I think my view is that actually, if you can try and make it more real world, okay, and get a debate, and maybe it's just me, and say, this is a controversy that you may have heard about, rather than starting, and it's a long time since I did it, so I recognise I'm speaking from memory and disinterested memory at the time, and a great deal of I've still got the bruises, those damn chairs. So I think that's a moot point. I think it's an open question, and I don't think we should reject it simply because it's not the way we've done it, because the idea is to interest people, grab them, and I'm not saying A-levels and physics degrees should be done in that way.
Okay, Bill.
Well, just a couple of points. The science to be aware, for example, of the human papillomavirus. From what I can make out of the discussion about the human papillomavirus, it's actually very little to be aware of. There's 1,000 cases per annum in a population of probably 500,000 girls each year. It costs 250 quid a time. Debate. That's sociology, that's not science. It might be even an interesting aspect of media studies, but I mean, there's certainly, you can work out a scientific aspect to it, but you're not even going to get close if you haven't studied enzymes, amino acids, vaccination, done a few titrations, actually understand how these things work. So I think there's a danger there. Now, I'm not denying, Ruth, that some of our students are, essentially bloody brilliant, but I think that's despite the teaching that they're getting rather than because of it. I think there will always be a few in each generation who will, amaze us. But the reality is, in the figures I gave you at the beginning, there's a decline, and not just a minor decline, a third, 30% decline in chemistry, physics, which needs to be addressed somehow. In my experience, any teacher that stands at the front of the class and say, "Hey kids, this is fun," the kids are thinking, "Why don't you grow up? I want to be taught something," and that's not what you're meant to be doing. Now, maybe it's not all going to happen that way. Hopefully not. Now, just a quick other thing, because I think we haven't touched on I know you want to draw some other things later, but on the whole justification of grant applications, which Monica raised, which I think is very important, and I'm not averse either to the fact that scientists ought to justify themselves. But I want them to justify themselves scientifically, not managerially. And the reality is that there's now a new specialism of expert who are more comfortable justifying their written proposals than they are conducting science. There's a new breed of application writer who's become very successful in universities and doing very well, getting all sorts of grants, but actually quite a lot of the science they're doing is pretty pointless, especially as it feeds into the agendas set in part by government. If you write one of these applications, as some of you may have done, you'll know that there's just a few pages about your proposal, then a few more pages about your risk assessment and the ethics involved, which is already moving away from the actual science. Then some more pages about how you're going to communicate your outcomes and disseminate and which groups are going to benefit from it. And you actually need to state your milestones and outputs and methodology. That's not science. You know, if I knew the outputs before I started, how's that scientific? And if I knew, you know, surely there should be latitude for me to completely change my methodology halfway through, which a lot of these grant applications don't allow you to do. So I just think...
Oh, I think you're being a bit unfair there. You can write an application and you can put all that stuff in, and then 3 years later, you've done the
justify
project.
it again.
No, 3 years later, you've done the project, and instead of going that way, it's actually gone that way. Now, a research council doesn't mind and is often quite happy that it's gone that way instead of that way, as long as it has actually produced something useful and something interesting and useful from the end of it. You might have said, right, I'm going to do this research and I'm going to prove that red is green, and you've actually come up and you've proved that red is purple or something like that. You know, it usually, if you're taking a scientific problem, you have to say, right, okay, this is the problem I want to tackle. But when you actually do it, the problem might change completely. And I don't think research councils mind that. I think they're quite happy with that, as long as you can say, well, actually, you know, I didn't waste this money, which is, you know, if you said, well, actually, what I did was I just buried the money in a box in the ground and I didn't do anything with it, then that's not right.
Okay, quick response.
Well, Ruth's projects take 16 years. Where's the last time you saw a research council giving somebody 16 years funding?
Me? I mean, I work on space missions, all right?
Okay. Okay, right, I'm going to bring the audience in, but Ruth, anything you wanted to say?
So on the science education, I'm pretty unrepentant that everybody needs a basic education in science. If you can't understand what the difference between a hypothesis and some sense of what statistics are and what risk is, you're going to make some very bad decisions. You've probably, and I'm not sure because I haven't done the calculations, but you've probably, if you're a woman, got a higher chance of getting cancer from HPV than you have of winning the lottery. And people don't understand that because they'll buy lottery tickets and not have a vaccination. So I think there is some basic level of science that everybody needs to have just to be literate in the world. But science is complicated and very deep, and everybody cannot be an expert. So we will have to educate people to a much higher level to make them competitive on a world scale. And I don't think we need to be apologetic about the science in the UK. If you look at the scientific publications, we account for 9% of the publications in the world. That's a very high output, second only to the United States. And if you look at citations, the number of times those publications are cited, we're at 12%, which ineffectively means that the quality is good. And so I don't think we need to be quite as apologetic as we have been, or look so badly on science educators. But I think we need to get a grip and make sure that we look forward and we provide the education that kids are going to need. That's it.
Okay, thanks. Right, let's get all the comments in.
No, I haven't said anything yet. I
Right.
just want to say that
Go
I
on.
don't believe in UFOs.
Okay. We're very pleased to hear that. Right, let's get everybody in because we're going to run out of time very soon. Right, I'm going to start with people who haven't spoken yet. So I'm going to take this lady here, Sonia, I believe your name is. Then I'm going to take this guy here whose name is Keith, I know him, and then the guy behind.
Oh, yes. Okay. Well, two issues I wanted to just bring in to raise. One was the role of environmental science. I know a lot of them. We've got lots of students. We give them master's degrees of science, and they do environmental this and environmental that, and they have no physics, chemistry whatsoever. It is just this environment. Anything you link with environment now seems to be wonderful. But these people do not really understand what they're talking about, these environmental managers we send out. They really are environmentalists who have a very selective view of science. So I'm just going to see whether anybody of you has experience of environmental science, which isn't really science at all, but it's the collection of threats and dangers. And this, I think, is undermining higher education science. I now have social science colleagues, for example, social science colleagues, who label themselves as doing sustainability science, whatever that is. So something is going on there. And the other issue I wanted to raise about science in government. It's my understanding from the mandarins themselves, a lot of science has been, internal scientific advice, internal research has been closed down the last decades. It's now handed out to universities or to consultancies. Now, that is a dangerous thing for government to take its scientific advice from people who want the next research grant funded, or from people who will tell them what they think government wants to hear.
Okay, wait your turn. Wait your turn.
Advice.
Okay, right. This gentleman. Sorry, wait your turn, please. This gentleman here.
Okay, I'm a scientist, research scientist, and have written grant applications and have also had publications. I think one of the issues is that the gatekeepers of knowledge have changed, and this is a danger. The old gatekeepers of knowledge and the way a scientist's career went forward was on his past research, on his past publications, etc., etc. What's now happened today is that in order to have a scientific career, you have to be seen to be getting money in. That means you have to sell future research, and that is much more open to political manipulation than past research that's completed. And I'll just leave it at that as a sort of statement, that it's the gatekeepers of change. It's become the research councils and the people giving grants, which are also their political appointments down there. And that's the old scientific gatekeepers with the editors of the journals and the chief editor.
Okay, thank you. Right, that gentleman there who wants to speak, I will get you in. And then can we have the microphone to this lady here, please, in the white?
I suppose I'm following on from this idea of power and the gatekeepers of knowledge, as this gentleman put forward. It seems as if, from examples given by the panel and things like this, that the battle for science, the problem of science in the 21st century is as much as who has science and who is delivering science, who is educating science, where is science seen to be going, who is science seen to be in a constructivist, sorry, I'll slow down a little bit. Is science seen to be viewed from a constructionist perspective, or is it seen to be as a purely objectivist idea? Is it going to seek for truth independently of our culture? Basically, what I'm trying to bring it down to is a couple of disagreements, a couple of things that have come up in this debate. First of all, whether or not it's interesting. I think whether science should be interesting, whether science is interesting, and how it should be portrayed to students, especially as relating to something that I think his name's Bill, the brother Bill in the end there, brought forward about this this paper that was an analysis of how we should behave, or how we should respond to a chemical or a terrorist attack. And actually, the questions that you stated that they'd already made their assumptions about that led to that paper being produced. And that sort of level of assumptions that are being made by science is actually rendering science in the hands of people who have already made those assumptions, have determined the course of knowledge through those assumptions. And so science is now becoming raveled within basically class politics. It becomes part of a power struggle, basically, for knowledge, and where is knowledge going to lead us? And
okay. Quite quickly, because we're going to have to. You want to get everybody else in, so please finish quickly.
What I wanted to say to people then is that they feel that is a very, very prominent issue with science in the 21st century, the reclamation maybe of science away from class and power.
Okay, thank you very much. This lady here.
I wanted to ask the panel about what they thought about the international role of science, because the lecture is titled Science in the 21st Century, and it doesn't disclose that entirely to the United Kingdom. In my sort of idealistic, naive sort of view, I sort of hope that science transcends all the national boundaries anyway, so it shouldn't matter who does the science. But having said that, I think it's tragic and it is lamentable that the numbers in Britain have decreased dramatically. And furthermore, you have the increase of exports of people from India and China who are pursuing pure science degrees, and furthermore the exodus of scientists to places like America when they can get like Blue Skies research grants without having to justify quite so significantly their purpose of the research. So is this dangerous for science as a whole, or is it just dangerous for Britain?
Okay, thank you very much. Very good question. Right, I'm going to take people who haven't spoken first, and then quickly people who've spoken already. So this gentleman here in the coat, and then this gentleman here.
I want to respond to the lady who's concerned about environmentalists such as myself, but I actually study chemistry. I'm willing to put the work in, but it's too hard. Like you've just got such complicated stuff, like textbooks this thick, and nowadays we're all on the internet and stuff, and I think chemistry as I study it is not going to exist in the 21st century, because there'll be no more oil left after pretty soon. So
okay. keep some order because we're going to run out of time. This guy here, right, put your hand up if you're desperate to speak.
Did you do the GCSE?
Yeah, we'll get you in, don't worry. Right, so this gentleman and then the guy with the microphone.
My name's Nico MacDonald. Very briefly, a question for all the panel about what effect, if any, the condemnation of technologies or scientific developments such as GMOs might have on the motivation of people wanting to be scientists. Maybe there's no effect on that, but that seems to be a novel phenomenon in terms of barriers to people being recruited into science. And the second, this is to Ruth and perhaps to Evan. In the IT communication industries, which fund a lot of scientific research in physics particularly, there seems to have been a reduction in the R of the R&D, research and development, in favour of investment in things which are going to have a short-term development. Clearly, in the pharma industry, it's still pretty long-term. Are you aware of any phenomena of reduction of commercially based research, not government-based research, because of a demand for marketising products sooner and doing less blue skies research?
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah.
I have just two simple points really. First one being about science education in itself. It's all very well saying that you're going to tell students about global warming and pollution, so on and so forth, but unless you actually give them a foundation and a basis from which to understand what you're telling them, there's no point. I currently have gone through a science GCSE and I can't tell you the difference between Al Gore's inconvenient truth and whether global warming is caused by sun rays. The second point I have is for people who support grants and committees is simply asking you, would Einstein get a grant today?
Okay, thank you. Right, now, so who's desperate to speak? Right, Mr. Perks. Are you trying to speak? Yeah, well, you go first because you haven't spoken, then Mr. Perks.
A basic question for the politician among you. You've said that you support the new science curriculum. Do you think that it'd be a fair point to say that the curriculum doesn't actually aid bad teachers, it merely hampers good ones? If you've got a good science teacher, they're going to impart to you all the passion and knowledge that they have. But if you've got a bad science teacher, telling them what to teach isn't going to make them magically a good one.
Okay, thank you. Right, Mr. Perks, these two people and then the speakers.
Ruth, I can't really let go what you said about science education, I'm afraid, because the way you phrased it isn't education. It's telling young people who aren't going to be scientists what to think about vaccinations, what to think about whatever particular issue it is that you think is important to tell them about. That's treating them like they're stupid. And I really don't think that's good enough, because if you give them a decent education, that's one thing. But just using it as a device for propaganda, whether it's about vaccinations or whatever, is another thing. We have to be careful about this, because that's old-fashioned elitism. That's like saying some people are just not worth educating. And we just need to be careful about that, because you can call it education, but it's not.
Okay, thank you. Yeah.
Okay, so I just want to try and quickly come back to put my finger on the question I asked earlier, which is, there's clearly a tyranny of over-justification, and we can debate how much is too much. But my question was not that. My question was for non-applied, non-translational research, what justification should look like. And Bill referred to scientific justification, and it's not clear to me what exactly that is. So does it look like what this gentleman referred to, more like kind of internal science peer review, or does it look like assessing a scientist's past record? How do we assess what blue sky, non-applied research should look like? I don't know what kind of justification you were referring to.
Okay, thank you very much. And yeah, finally.
Thank you very much. I just want to come back to a couple of Evan's comments. You mentioned that maybe the reluctance to accept the new science curriculum is due to fear of change amongst older teachers. I don't doubt there is an element of fear of change amongst the older science teachers. Myself, on the other hand, when I started teacher training, it was during the very first year that they introduced science for the 21st century, which is an excellent buzzword, by the way. Now, the problem with the new science curriculum, the scientific knowledge in it, most of that was already covered in Key Stage 3. In 2008, this won't be a problem, as they're dumbing it down even further, but then we might have problems with them getting restless because they might have covered it in Key Stage 2. Also, the kids want practical work. They love practical work. These are the comments I hear all the time. Sir, are we doing a practical? Are we doing a practical? When can we do a practical? Unfortunately, it would seem with the new GCSEs, the lovely people with compulsive risk assessment psychosis seem to have taken most of the practicals out of it. We have units on radioactivity and radiation without practicals in it, just demos, and the only stuff they have is this reliance on worksheets where you work out your radiation exposure per year, which is supposed to teach them something. And finally, this idea that media is driving the science curriculum, the topics that are being discussed. Media should never drive science. Yourself, Evan, sure you're familiar with how science is reported in the media. Not very well. Let's put it that way.
We've got Death.
Yes, I know, Dr. Death in the Daily Mail. I've seen it. We have also...
very quickly.
I will be very, very quick. The quality of teachers going into teaching. We have a young chap over there who found chemistry quite difficult, yet he's an environmental scientist. Yeah. We also have teachers, I remember doing an observation where she gave the impression that there was a risk of developing autism from MMR in one of these lovely, lovely debates. Because they're not looking at the primary evidence, we're getting misconceptions being inserted in, and it becomes nothing more than barroom science. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Right, panel, your final thoughts. There's a lot there. It's up to you.
Right, can I...
Yeah, Monica, you go. You're desperate to speak. Go on.
No, well, I was just, we started with Bill last time, we start with me this time. I just want to support what the guy over here, the science teacher, was saying about needing more practical work, and from that comes inspiration. And then this speaks to the gentleman here who said he was a STEM ambassador or whatever and hadn't been called in to schools. And the experience that I've had is that primary schools, key stages 1 and 2, they have plenty of time. Teachers have plenty of time and are really keen to get extra specialists in. It's once you get into the later stages when things are too curriculum driven, when teachers don't have time then to get in specialists to just to make things a little bit more exciting, a bit more interesting. And that's a shame, because that's the time when you're talking to teenagers, when it is very difficult to actually to keep their interest. This is completely, I guess, off the subject. But this is the idea of educating people in science. In that scientists are happy to go and see a play by Shakespeare, to go and hear a concert. Scientists are happy to be regarded as cultural people. People who are non-scientists do not seem to take the same pleasure in boasting that they can understand or take great pleasure in looking at a piece of mathematics or something like that. Okay, maybe they do chess problems, bridge problems, or belong to astronomy clubs, which is a great way of understanding science. But we had, I'm not saying foisted on us, but we were invited to have in the science faculty, we were invited to have an artist in residence. And this is very common now in science faculties. You get an artist in residence. And we said, yeah, okay, we will have an artist in residence if, and only if, the science faculty will have a scientist in residence. And they said, what for? The arts faculty would have a scientist in residence. And they said, well, what for? What would they do? And they said, well, they will bring science to you in the same way as you want to bring art to us uncultured scientists. Nothing happened. All right, and that seems to be the way things go. It's like science is perceived as being difficult and specialist. It's not seen as absolutely fundamental to everything we want to do and understand. Whether it's understanding about MMR or HPA, whether it's understanding about GMOs, whether it's understanding about whether there are UFOs and evidence for them or not. We need to have a much more scientifically literate populace, and that can only start in schools, and that can only start with scientifically literate, committed teachers.
Okay, thank you very much, Monica. And Ruth, please.
Right, 3 quick points. I'm not sure what part of what I said the gentleman on the right there interpreted as patronising or something, but I'm not telling students anything. What I'm proposing is pretty much what you said, that teachers give them a basic grounding in science so that they're able to question what they see and make informed choices. That was my point. The second point I want to make, somebody asked about reduction in research and whether we were seeing a reduction in the R part of R&D. And I would say, no, we're not seeing a reduction in research. Probably the opposite, we're seeing a big increase in research, but actually a trend to do it outside of the company and to do it more in partnership with universities, biotechs, small entities, do it in very different ways and be much more flexible about it. And my third point was a question somebody asked about science being global and, is it good for the world? And of course, advancing science can only be good, in my view. We have to decide what we do with the knowledge, but the knowledge is independent of value, except when it comes to economic wealth and generating value and prosperity for a country. And in that case, I see it as good for many parts of the world, but we're at the risk of it being better for some other parts of the world than it is for Britain right now.
Thanks very much, Ruth. Evan.
Yes, the man with the mic asked me about the science curriculum, and I'm not qualified, because I don't know the detail of the science curriculum, to say whether it's good or bad. I'm just going to, so I'll accept that. But I've already conceded the point that everything requires teachers. So it's not a question of hampering good teachers or challenging bad teachers. We need decent teachers. But then within that, I think there is an argument for trying to get people interested in starting to study the subject. Okay? That's what I'm prepared to accept. I don't think there's any inconsistency by regretting the fact that science policy is media driven, but that's different from me arguing, and I'm saying that scientists must engage with the media, okay, or science must engage with the media through the work of the Science Media Centre and so forth. And therefore, I think it's reasonable to say, look, if the media's out there talking rubbish, scientists need to get engaged with that and try and correct it. That's not being led by the media, it's opposing the media. And in the same way, I think if people, and it's a big if, and it has to be tested, I accept, that we can get people interested in science because of things in current affairs, we should seize the opportunity. On the question of IT, from the gentleman in IT about R&D, I mean, there's a target, government target, that there should be 2.5% GDP spend on R&D, and the public sector's kept up with that, but the private sector has not, and we're stuck at 1.8, and it went up to 1.9 one year. The government said we're on target. Went down to 1.7, so we've plateaued. Okay, went up to 1.8, and then they just used the last year, not the fact they were at 1.9 2 years ago. It's exactly the rubbish I'm talking about. And then they said in Select Committee the other day it was never a very important target. And I said, have you ever called a target you have met not a very important target? Silence. So there is a fundamental problem with our failure to be long-termist, and I suspect some of it is the failure to willing to do the R, and we'll just do the D of what we have at the moment. But again, there's probably data to back that up. Finally, I thought it was a very good question asked about what is the future versus past, whether which we should be back judged on, and I think it was the question over here as well, how do we justify Blue Skies research? Is it on what you've done before, or how can you justify the idea as being good enough to fund when it's still just an idea? It's an important question. I would say that I think it's got to be a combination of the two. If you're looking at an interesting question from a basic point of view, and your grant is being reviewed by people in your field, not people who are focused on applications, then I think there's an argument that you will have a fair process. The fundamental thing I want to see changed in respect of government and the media is an understanding of the scientific process, specifically the understanding of the difference between peer-reviewed published work that adds to the scientific knowledge and an opinion. Okay, whether it's an opinion by a scientist like Jim Watson, or whether it's an opinion by Amanda Platel, whoever she is. Ugly woman.
Okay, we're going to need to finish there. Bill.
Very quickly, I can't answer everything in detail. Obviously, I think, how does non-applied science get justified? It may be that scientists of that ilk are going to have to look to new networks to fund it, whatever that means, and we can discuss that afterwards. I get quite often asked, such and such an industry funded that science, it's clearly biased in these kinds of meetings. I have to point out, do you think the government's neutral? So, maybe we need to think more creatively of the kind of sorts of funding that we could obtain in relation to a few things. Great question on the international dimension of science. I think it's ironic that just as we in the West have become paralysed by our doubts and focus on uncertainty within science, others around the world, particularly in Southeast Asia, but also in places like Africa, are very keen to develop, very keen to look at GM and the benefits that it could bring. The solution so far from our side has been to try and export our concerns to those people who are keen to develop and to ensure that their industries are regulated according to our standards of uncertainty and doubt. I think one of the big problems is that scientists in the contemporary world, like many other groups and institutions, and we've heard throughout this conference this weekend, lack direction and confidence in their own work. And they think that they are more popular if they adapt to public perceptions, media agendas, government funding sources, and things like that. I think it's a catastrophe. Evan raised creationism as an issue in his introduction. I think he overstates the case. There's a handful of creationists trying to advocate teaching it in schools, even in the US. It's probably best for scientists to ignore them, okay, and to actually promote what they're confident about, which is science itself. But even if you think there's too many creationists, right, rather than it's like having a debate with a UFO believer, right? Ignore it and teach people your science, and then let people trust people to decide. And the crisis is that we actually lack confidence in science itself, and are saying, therefore we need to intervene in the creationism debate, thereby corrupting what science becomes. And I think we need, and scientists in particular, need to regain the science agenda and the institutions of science before they've damaged them irreparably, which sadly I think they're well on the way to doing.
Okay, thank you to our panel.